All right, let's get back to NWSL off-season action. You know what? Let's start with expansion groups. Let's start there. There's a couple different areas and directions in which we could take this segment of the show, but I think we got to chat a little bit about expansion because I think that's something that gets folks excited. I think it also sends a signal, I think, to folks, the audiences who say, what's going on with NWSL? They're talking about all the success and the growth of the league, and sometimes folks out there equate growth with expansion. And that's a different debate for a different day. I'm on the other side of that debate, but expansion is always exciting because, especially coming out of a NWSL championship final, there was a lot of chatter about it. We heard pretty often throughout that week from NWSL Commissioner Jessica Berman, and she joined us at one point for an episode of Attacking Third out there, and got a lot of questions about expansion. And this has sort of been kind of, in the news cycle for some time, even before the championship final. What could it look like? How soon could it arrive for NWSL? But the deadline is now passed at this point. Now at the time of us doing this episode. But last week during the championship final, as Berman was addressing questions about it, had said at that moment in time that the deadline was approaching and that the target is 2024 and 2 possible expansion sides for that year. But as of now, over 100 applications and submissions for that deadline. I think it says a lot about different markets and the league itself, and people wanting to, those groups wanting to be a part of NWSL.
I mean, even looking at the growth from 2021 to 2022, adding into expansion sides in San Diego Wave FC and Angel City FC and LA. Yes, 2 California teams, but you look at they broke records in their attendance that they had. LA playing at the Bank of California, San Diego initially playing at Terreo and then moving to Snapdragon and getting those tickets sold for Snapdragon. I think ticket revenue increased 125% from last year, according to the league. And yes, that is large in part due to those 2 California sides. But if you build it, they will come, right? And that's exactly what we learned from these NWSL teams growing into this year. So the commissioner of the NWSL, Jessica Berman, did say that she was expecting to receive 5 to 10, quote, meaningful bids for an NWSL expansion side. Because, yes, there are a lot of cities and there are a lot of teams that want to advance their status as a club or get an NWSL club to their city. But there's so much more that goes into it. It's not just like, hey, I'm Lisa in Philadelphia and I would like an NWSL team here. Like, you need investors, you need a foundation, you need a partnership perhaps with the MLS team that's in your city. There's a lot that actually has to go into it. So yes, over 100 bids or something brought into this, but about 5 to 10 meaningful bids that are actually like, okay, in a year's time, we could have a team there with a stadium, with practice facilities, and you could get fans to the games, because there's so many different metrics and factors that honestly come into all of this. But I mean, I'm still making a bid for NWSL in Philadelphia. I don't think we're going to get it quite yet, but there's been a lot of different teams and cities that are coming in. I know NWSL to the Bay Area, that's led by people like Ali Wagner, Danielle Slayton, former national team players that are in the Bay Area. And yes, that would be a 3rd California team, but I don't hate it, because clearly there's an appetite for women's soccer in California and in Northern California, of course. I think Utah is also another area that's expected to receive a bid. But for 2024, there has been a team there. They got moved to Kansas City. I mean, there are a lot of different places. You look at Minnesota as well, the Aurora, looking for a bid to get an NWSL team. What do you think, Sandra?
I think there's going to be a whole, my initial reaction to it when Berman was talking about it during championship weekend was, that yes, there were going to be a whole ton of applicants. And I was in agreement, in which Berman said that it's actually going to serve as a bit of a weaning out process. Because while I'm with you. Well, it's very lucrative, I think, for some clubs or some of their brands to include a women's professional soccer team in their mix, right? I think the commissioner and board of governors and the other teams, the other 12 clubs that are currently in existence in the NWSL, want to ensure that they have, the right partners, right,
Right.
within the mix. So, like you said, we've heard a lot about the Bay Area. We've had some of the owners on the show to talk about expansion to the Bay Area specifically. I think we did an episode with Brandy Chastain and Allie Wagner to chat a little bit about that. But I mean, it's a movement that's in the process of being led by former players, right? And
Yeah.
you mentioned Danielle Slayton and Allie Wagner. So it just it seems, I think folks might be like, wow, a third California team, but I'm with you. It's a huge. First of all, it's a huge state. One, in the literal sense, it's just a very large state. But two, it's no secret that California has had a long ties to really outstanding soccer programs, right? When it comes to women's soccer, and obviously there's a lot of eyes on Utah, as the Real Salt Lake, soccer holdings was sold, and there was a new ownership group that came into the Salt Lake area, and that included the possibility of adding the Utah Royals into the mix of teams and brands that they have out there in Utah. That there was a possibility to sort of revive them, bring them back from the long nap that they've been taking. And I think for folks who are maybe looking at some of the news that have dropped out there, that these are the two teams that perhaps have the targets, that maybe these are the likely two teams. But again, that's a lot of applicants. You're talking about over 100. That's probably a ton of different markets, a ton of different cities. And I think in terms of, potential ease into the league, I think that's part of why
Right.
the Royals perhaps seem to look to have that kind of, not green light. I will just say like yellow green light at the moment, like to have
It's
this
not
path.
red. It's not red.
So they're definitely not on red. So to sort of have this path back into the league. But I think it's interesting to know that Berman was also asked questions specifically about Utah and the Royals. I think at the time when everything was kind of buttoned up and tied up with a bow, that the potential for a Utah Royals expansion team to return back in had a certain price point around it, and a lot has changed in this league. Valuations for certain teams have skyrocketed, and I believe the original valuation around it was like somewhere between 2 to 3 million, and that is out. It's foolishness at this point. That's not something I think that the league might have to have conversations about. That it's all, I think it's also all going to depend on everything within the applications and the process of expansion, and all the legalese that I'm sure they're going to have to go through. Is it possible to raise that number up? Is it too ironclad of a contract to say no, this is where it stands, and yes, 2 million is going to be the fee that's going to be the total amount for you to make your return. There's also other things around a team returning to Utah that players have been vocal about, in terms of things like the current political climate and women's rights and women's health care, that players in this league have been vocal about. And so when they're looking at markets and when they're looking at cities, Berman and others have said that is something else that they will take into consideration, that there will always be player first mentality even when it comes to expansion. So is that a city, is that a market, is that a state in which it will benefit players to play there and within it, right? So these are all very very different things to take into consideration, right? When they're going to look at all of these expansion bids. But I think there's other people. I was gonna say, I think there's other people that are like, who wants a third California team? But
yeah, I mean, it's needless to say, it is not black and white by any means. It's not black and white, and you have to. I think yes, having a Utah team where there's already been one, it does shed a positive light on like, okay, it's happened before, we could do it again, but also, hey, it happened before and it didn't work out. So now where do we go from here? I think you also have to take a look at the MLS sides that have said, hey, we want to expand and grow, because currently there are a number of teams in the league, the NWSL, that have partnerships with MLS sides. You look at Orlando, Houston, Portland, Washington, like they have all of these other facilities and things that they can share and partner with and utilize that, whether it's with double headers or with front office staff and ownership, things like that. There's just so much of it that comes into it. I know other MLS teams that put in bids are Atlanta, Austin, Toronto, looking
Texas.
for NWSL.
Another big state, right?
Yeah.
Like what are the states that can have multiple teams and it sort of feel like it's still spread apart? California and Texas, right, are two of those. It's going to be interesting to see if it's like if it'll be a combination of like an MLS affiliated team, or perhaps, and then the second team, being a non-MLS team, I also think it's important to know that, prior to the NWSL Championship and Berman's State of the League during that time, that there was a previous, media availability, from Berman. And I think initial phrasing that was used for expansion was intention, that there's intention for two teams. So, I mean, expansion we know can look very, very different in this league. Expansion can look like two brand new markets jumping into the fold, and expansion can also, unfortunately, look like the adoption and the absorption of a former club, and ensuring that there's another market for a franchise to go to. So it's something I think that we're going to continue to keep our eye on, and in the build up to 2024. It just sort of feels like this is really just kind of like the first step in terms of getting all of those applicants and getting all those submissions, and then kind of having to wean out the process. And I would imagine that bids that were placed and are going to be declined will probably be told first before the markets and bids who will join, given the news that they're going to link up. So it'll probably be a lengthy process. Like
we won't find out anytime soon, and this isn't until a 2024 expansion. So we have a little bit of time.
It's just something to keep an eye on, right? There's going to be a long build up in the process to this, and it should be met with excitement, because like I said, growth looks different from everywhere. I mean, I was very impressed to hear that a franchise like Minnesota Aurora, wanted to place a bid. I kind of think that they're not dark horses; they're probably like long shots. I would imagine that there's probably several bids in front of them that probably have a more complete package in terms of a bid to have an NWSL side. I think there's, again, there's just so many things that come into consideration when considering an expansion team in a market. And I think a big one of those things is like infrastructure, right? Like now with the CBA in full swing as well for players and between the league, that's going to be one of those things. I mean, there's literal clauses in the CBA where it talks about, playing facilities and, on turf versus on grass. Are the bids that are being placed by these potential markets and cities, do they have the actual infrastructure in place to be a fully professionalized team?
And Minnesota Aurora already has a team, right? They're already competing in the Women's Super League or not the Women's Super League, but in the lower level league in the United States for women's professional soccer. So that's also another kind of ripple effect that comes into it, because there are already those players that are competing on that team. What kind of happens there? I mean, I like that they threw their hat in the ring. I think it's a solid debate. But at this point in time, I just don't see Minnesota Aurora making the jump into the NWSL by 2024.
We'll see. They might be one of those teams that are told, hey, this looks great, but maybe next time, maybe for the next round, we'll have to pay attention to it. And again, all this stuff is exciting to chat about. I'm sure the next time there's another State of the League by Berman, there will be some sort of update, and it's something that we'll get to chat about.